I'm delighted to be here, and thanks to Jason and everyone with Anti-Corruption International for inviting me. And I'm very pleased to be able to take part in the launch of this very important group. I think it's important that young people are engaged in the fight against corruption. I was young once myself when I started Transparency International 12 years ago here. I was in my late 20s, technically still young, and as you can see from my beard and my receding hairline, it has aged me somewhat. I do hope you will stick in there, because this is a long-term struggle. This is not going to be fought and won over the next few years. This is a struggle that will last hundreds of years. Corruption has been with us for as long as people have been organising themselves in societies, or as long as governments have been established and people have been elected to public office. Power has been abused everywhere since the beginning of modern history. Transparency International, for those of you who are not familiar with us, was founded back in 1995 by a group of retired international civil servants, people working with the World Bank and the United Nations and so on. And since '95, the organisation has grown into a movement of around 100 chapters. The Irish chapter here is a small organisation with 2 full-time members of staff, or 2.5, depending on what projects we're working on at any one time. And like Anti-Corruption International, our goal is to raise awareness, is to inform the public, to inform decision makers of the costs of corruption and measures that we can introduce to tackle this problem, which has cost the Irish taxpayer, Irish citizens, billions of euros. We can see this over the last few years through the bailout of our banks, that we've lost well over 30 billion euros, arising from many different types of wrongdoing, not necessarily defined as corruption in and of itself, but arising from abuses of power and failure to stop abuse, to stop or to check conflicts of interest. Corruption isn't seen as a particularly big problem by the international community here in Ireland. Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index tells us that Ireland, relatively speaking, is not that corrupt. That's relatively speaking. Ireland is ranked 17th out of 175 countries on the Corruption Perceptions Index. Those countries that are perceived to be least corrupt appear at the top of the index. Those that are perceived to be most affected by corruption are at the bottom. So at the top you see countries like Denmark, New Zealand, most of the Scandinavian countries. Ireland is in that second sector or second tier of countries which are perceived to be relatively clean by international standards. But when you look at those countries that are almost directly below Ireland, you'll see that this situation isn't as bright as one might first believe it to be. And I've travelled quite a bit with Transparency and seen the scale of corruption up front in many parts of the world, in Central Asia or East Asia. I've seen police officers who are drunk on duty, leaning against trees, walking in front of cars, stopping the taxi driver, taking the taxi driver out the back of the car, and the taxi driver would have a bottle of vodka to give to the police officer. In Russia, you pay $20,000 to get into the police academy, so you can then make more money as a traffic police officer. In Georgia, about 15 years ago, the entire traffic police corps was fired because of rampant corruption. Back in the 1970s, the Drug Enforcement Agency, well over 80% of the Drug Enforcement Agency officers were on the take from heroin dealers and drug smugglers. That was in New York. And we have suffered from different types of corruption here, but the problem doesn't seem to manifest itself in the same way that it does in Indonesia or Tajikistan or Kazakhstan, places where petty corruption, what's known as petty corruption, official corruption, is rampant, where doctors, nurses, teachers, everyone is engaged in the informal economy and sees it as corruption as a means to make a living. Thankfully, our police officers, generally speaking, are clean. We have had exceptions. We worked with two of the whistleblowers, Maurice McCabe and John Wilson, and exposing abuse of the Garda traffic management records. But you won't be stopped by police officers or immigration officials at Dublin Airport and ask for a bribe. You won't be pulled over and asked for money to get away with a speeding ticket. That generally does not happen here. Corruption has manifested itself in a more subtle way. More recently, we go back to recent history. Corruption was a big deal in politics. The modern history of corruption begins with Charles Haughey, former Prime Minister, who received in the region of £8 million from business people. There was not necessarily a quid pro quo involved, but he was very much very close to those who helped him live the lifestyle that he became accustomed to. Charles Haughey was on a salary of around £14,000, I think, at the beginning of the 1980s, and he owned his own yacht, he owned his own private island, a mansion, race horses. He lived a lifestyle of a multi-millionaire. And our tribunals of inquiry, these truth commissions that helped expose corruption not just in our political elites or among our political elites, but in our local authorities as well. They showed how money was changing hands to change the use or designation of land from agricultural use to residential or commercial use for relatively small amounts of money, £1,000 here, £2,000 there, to change the use of land from agricultural to use for housing or for business. This increased the price of land by tenfold in many cases, and there was an incentive for people to pay bribes to local politicians to change the way in which land was used. The Mann Tribunal, which was a tribunal of inquiry which lasted around 15 years, found that corruption was systemic in local government up until the early 1990s. And the government has gone some way to address the kind of corruption that was engaged in by Charles Haughey and by local councillors. So it has introduced requirements to disclose assets and political donations. It has put caps on the amount of political donations that political parties can receive or candidates can receive. And it has introduced registers of interests that local authority members and senior officials in local authorities have to fill in so that people can see whether there is a conflict of interest when deciding on land use in future. More recently, it's introduced whistleblower legislation. It's introduced a register of lobbyists. John, I'm sure, will talk about. And we've seen some movement. We've seen a lot of reform, on paper at least, over the last few years. The problem is that very many of the people who have been engaged in wrongdoing of some form or another, or who have questions to answer about their dealings with politicians, have never been held to account. So, for example, the Moriarty Tribunal, which had investigated the source of income or payments to senior politicians, including Charles Haughey, also found that there was during the course of the award of a licence for Ireland's second mobile telephone contract, that €1 million in payments and benefits were made by a wealthy man who should remain nameless for now, and the Minister for Communications, Michael Lowry, who was found to be corrupt. And this billionaire has gone on to bigger and better things. He's now owner of Ireland's largest newspaper group. He is owner of Ireland's largest chain of petrol stations. He owns the biggest engineering company responsible for installing water meters in Ireland. He's had a lot of money, millions of euros, written off in loans that he owed a state-owned bank, IBRC, and has just won an injunction against RTE, the Irish state broadcaster, not to disclose his dealings with that bank. There has been no movement by the Director of Public Prosecutions to follow through on the findings of the Moriarty Tribunal. We found that this man had made these payments to the Minister for Communications back in the late 1990s. Lesson here we can draw, and you pointed to the lack of enforcement of the OECD Convention, is that we've been quite good at reacting to past scandals, introducing measures to improve transparency, but we really suck at accountability, at holding people to account. Our criminal justice system is not geared to stopping very serious white-collar crime. It's not good at even questioning those who are alleged to have engaged in wrongdoing. And until that changes, I don't see any serious move against corruption here in Ireland. And the culture of impunity that breeds is infectious, and it also breeds a great deal of cynicism and skepticism towards our decision makers, to institutions of government, and breeds distrust amongst citizens of their leaders. The last few days have been a welcome break from the conversation we've been having around site-serve, around a lot of things that are bad about Irish society. It's nice to be talking about Ireland for a different reason, for a change. But we'll have to really focus our energies again on ensuring that Ireland becomes better at accountability. And I think that's one of the challenges, again, Anti-Corruption International, as well as groups like Transparency International, will have to meet. And I really look forward to working with you in making Ireland a much more accountable